Reconstruction. What is Reconstruction? Anyone ever hear of that term before? So Reconstruction, we're talking about a period of time from 1865 to 1877, right? This is a period of time that happens directly after the Civil War. And after the Civil War, the South, many of the southern states, experienced a lot of damage. We're talking about, railroads being destroyed, buildings, all different forms of infrastructure that was destroyed. But really, Reconstruction doesn't necessarily have to do with rebuilding the South physically. It's more so focused on rebuilding the social structure of the South. Okay, we're talking about race relations. Okay, bringing about equality for African Americans after the Civil War. So first, let's talk about social changes that took place in the African American community during Reconstruction. All right, we'll talk about the establishment of the Black church. So before the Civil War, African Americans were participating in Christianity. We have a lot of conversion to Christianity. You had African American slaves practicing Christianity on the plantations in private, secretly, oftentimes with the influence of African culture. You also had African American slaves as well as free African Americans that attended biracial churches in the South, meaning that there were both white and black members of the church, but they were segregated. They sat in different parts of the church during the services. Okay, but during Reconstruction, you start to see the independence of the Black church, meaning that a number of African Americans left the biracial churches to join their own churches, okay, to create their own churches. And the Black church was not just about church services, it was the center of the African American community. The church was responsible for a number of different social aspects in society. We're talking about the creation of schools, right? The church created schools for African American children. You have the church sponsoring social events, right? Bringing people together for political rallies. And Black preachers were involved in politics as well. You have around 250 Black preachers that actually gained office during Reconstruction. You also see an increase in education within the Black community at this time. Before the Civil War, it was illegal for African American slaves to be educated. It's against the law. Okay, so after the Civil War, during Reconstruction, you see a large increase in education for African Americans. Right, you have a number of Northerners moving to the South to teach in African American schools, and a lot of schools are built. We'll talk a little bit more about that later, but you see an increase in education, not just for primary schools, but also the first Black colleges are established during Reconstruction as well. And then you have the issue of land ownership, right? Owning land, the basis of freedom from the perspective of many African Americans, as well as many Anglo Americans during this time, right? If you own land, that's really the only way for you to be truly free. And so it's very important for African Americans to gain that land ownership during Reconstruction, okay? And so you have a number of African Americans actually taking over land, taking over properties that used to be owned by former Confederates after the Civil War, right? So there's a number of different cases here. You have Southerners, white Southerners who abandoned their lands because of the war, right? They're afraid and for their lives, and so they leave their lands, and those lands are just abandoned and sitting there. And then you have other cases where there's Confederate leadership or Confederate soldiers whose land was confiscated by the U.S. federal government, right? By the Union. All right, their land was confiscated because of their participation in the rebellion against the United States. All right, and so in both cases, you have open land, and many African Americans simply moved onto those lands and began living there. Okay, during the period of Reconstruction, we'll talk a little bit more about what happens with that later on. Okay, so land ownership, very, very important. Next, let's talk about the Freedmen's Bureau. What is that? What is the Freedmen's Bureau? Well, the Freedmen's Bureau is a federal agency that was created during Reconstruction. And what was the point of this federal agency? Well, they were supposed to establish schools in the South for African Americans. They're also supposed to help out the poor as well as the elderly. So they're supposed to provide funds for the poor and the elderly, right? That's all going through the Freedmen's Bureau. And also, they're supposed to establish racial equality. Okay, this is a federal agency that's supposed to establish racial equality in the South. That's a pretty tall order. It's going to take a very long time, but unfortunately, the Freedmen's Bureau only lasted from 1865 to 1870, 5 years, right? So they didn't establish racial equality, right? But that was supposed to be one of the purposes of the Freedmen's Bureau. Now, as far as the establishment of schools go, yes, the Freedmen's Bureau did help to establish a number of different schools, about 3,000 schools in the South, right? And they didn't do it alone. They helped to finance it, but there were also a number of northern organizations who participated in the establishment of schools in the South as well. But the Freedmen's Bureau did provide some financial support and coordinated the funds to help establish these schools in the South. Okay, so that was one thing that they did. They also helped to establish hospitals too for African Americans. There were a number of hospitals that were put together during the war, all right, where the Union put together hospitals for the soldiers. Those facilities ended up being used for African Americans during Reconstruction. Okay, the Freedmen's Bureau was involved with that as well. Now, going back to the issue of land ownership, right, we were just talking about. The Freedmen's Bureau was also supposed to be responsible for distributing land to African Americans. This is where we get the 40 acres and a mule, right? Have you guys ever heard of that before? 40 acres and a mule? It's pretty common phrase when we're talking about reparations for African Americans. Well, the point was that the Freedmen's Bureau was to take all that land that had been either confiscated or abandoned, right, that was owned by Confederates, and that land was supposed to be divided up into 40 acres, and those 40 acres were supposed to be given to African American families, as well as a mule was supposed to be provided as well to help with agriculture. But this whole idea of distributing land to African Americans so that they could have the basis of freedom and be self-sufficient, it didn't happen. And why didn't it happen? Because of President Andrew Johnson, right, who decided to give those lands that were either confiscated or abandoned back to their original owners, right? White Southerners, former supporters of the Confederacy. Okay, they got their land back. And for African Americans who were already living on those lands, remember I told you they had taken over properties, they were evicted from those lands. So African Americans were evicted from the lands that they were living on. So those lands were eventually given back to the original owners due to President Andrew Johnson, who took over after President Lincoln was assassinated. He was his vice president, right? So he steps in. He has completely different views on racial equality than Abraham Lincoln. He supports states' rights. We'll talk a little bit more about Johnson and his policies in a second. So the Freedmen's Bureau was not able to redistribute land to African Americans during that time, during Reconstruction, okay, which has a huge effect on economics within the African American community.